Namaste.
You're welcome.
Welcome to our weekly online satsang. Flowering Heart Satsang is a coming together of those whose hearts are flowering and are growing and awakening. We come from different teachers, different teachings, different meditation practices, different parts of the world, different countries and continents. We're drawn together by the fact that we're awakening and our hearts are flowering with unconditional love, compassion. So welcome. Glad you are joining us here tonight. We share throughout the satsang the Flowering Heart Blessing, which is a transmission of divine grace, of divine awareness, presence, a gift from the source itself for the purpose of catalyzing awakening. So you're basking in it right now, and you will be soaking it in for the rest of our time together this evening. Flowering Heart Blessing will initiate the process of awakening in the receiver. If that person is already in the process, it will hasten it and help to remove blocks and move the process along. If you're already one of the fortunate ones who is awakened, well, that's not a destination. It just keeps on going. And the Flowering Heart Blessing will just take you deeper and deeper into awakened awareness. So, that blessing is absolutely free. The Divine told Suzanne and me that it must be given away free of charge. And people must know that it comes directly from the Divine, not from a particular master or a particular organization or hierarchy or saint. It comes directly from the Divine. And so it truly is what we could call interfaith or transfaith. It supports whatever path you're on. And when you receive the Flowering Heart Blessing, you are instantly initiated to be able to pass it on to others. Simply call on the Divine Presence, invoke the Presence, and invite it to pour through you the Flowering Heart Blessing, and hold a person or group of people by intent in your heart, in meditation or in prayer, and the Divine will just flood them with the Flowering Heart Blessing. I almost certainly feel it flowing through you. The other way that we love to give it is in person, with someone who is physically present with their consent, lightly touching the top of their head, inviting the Divine to pour the blessing through us, and then just step back. Don't do anything. Don't try to make anything happen at all. The Divine does it all. And it's amazing what people experience and feel. And anyone you share this blessing with, they're initiated. It's so easy to start a blessing circle with the Flowering Heart Blessing. So all you need is one other person and the desire to share presence and to share blessing with one another, and you've got it. If you feel like you don't know how to articulate the explanations surrounding it, we have a 36-minute video on our website, floweringheart.org, which explains more in depth about the Flowering Heart Blessing, and there's a guided meditation of initiation there. But it's something that you could just play for a group or one other person, and you wouldn't have to say a thing. It's all there in 36 minutes, and you can start giving blessings. So please be part of a blessing group. It's great that we can come together online like this, and occasionally maybe even meet somewhere for a special meeting or conference. But it's important that we have a community locally where we live, with whom we can share our journey. We strengthen one another. We have more in common with other people that are awakening than we do with people that belong to our own faith tradition. If you belong to a temple or an ashram or a church, there are deep bonds with those people because you share a certain spiritual life and beliefs. But when you meet other people, whether they're in that group or some other group who are genuinely awakening and transforming, we have more in common with them than we could say our own people. So Yeah, so actually you and one other person could be a blessing circle. It could be a satsang. A satsang is a community of truth, or a spiritual community where two people on the path or more come together to share the journey, to share their depth, their peace, their presence with one another. So please make that happen. If you don't have one where you are, it's so easy, and that would truly be a great service to the greater good. What else? Really, all of that. I think that's all the news. We're glad Facebook came back. It was down all day long, and we weren't sure we were going to be here this way tonight. But even if that had happened, we would have continued to stream to Vimeo, LinkedIn, YouTube. There are various ways to access this particular webcast. If you're here, if you're not here, don't listen to this. If you're here, though, please give us a like or a love. Or, if you make a comment in the sidebar, that's fine. Then we see your name and we get to know you were here. But if you don't, or even if you do, if you give us a like or a love, we can look after the satsang and see who is with us. And that's always really nice. So we open it for questions and answers concerning the spiritual journey, awakening, divine union, God realization, meditation, reincarnation, speculation. If you have any questions about things that you're encountering in your own spiritual practice and journey, that's the most meaningful. And if you ask those questions, the divine will give us light to shine on that area where you're seeking clarification. The divine will give you clarity, and all of us will benefit from that. So that's always a great service. So just ask in your heart, is there something I should throw out there? Is there something I should ask about tonight? And that would be great. And then a little later on, we'll be doing, sending the Flowering Heart Blessing right now. And please join us, because all of you are initiated now to be able to share the Flowering Heart Blessing just because you're here and you're flowing and floating in it. But if you come from another group, another spiritual community that has its own form of blessing or Shaktipad or Diksha or Reiki, anything that is a gift from the divine source whose purpose is to catalyze awakening and cause the spiritual heart to flower with unconditional divine love, please join us. You're welcome to share your blessing as well. And just keep doing that. A little later on, we'll be sharing very powerful intent blessings for situations and needs that you've brought with you here tonight, that you're carrying in your heart. And we'll get to that later on. And then at the end, we'll conclude with the open eye light meditation, which is pretty cool. So bring on the questions, if there are any. We'll wait just a few minutes and see what happens. This is going to be a short one.
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, well, we are seriously
there we go.
wondering. William says, wondering about ashrams and monasteries. What are your thoughts on these? Do you think in our modern day it is necessary for some? Well, evidently, since monasteries and ashrams still exist, and there are people that are deeply feel the call to that kind of life. So, is it necessary for some? Probably. Is it necessary for everyone? Obviously not. In times past, past generations of seekers, I mean, turn back the clock 100 years. If we had a meeting with people that were talking about awakening and God realization, whether it was in the Western traditions or whether it was in the Eastern traditions, almost all of those people would be members of some spiritual order. And very likely, many, if not most of them, would be celibate. Things have changed a lot. Whereas 100 years ago, serious seekers of enlightenment went off into caves and monasteries and ashrams, secluded places, temples, and lived very, sometimes very austere, but very consecrated lives. Today, most people on the spiritual path are what they called in the East householders, lay people, people who live in the world, who have relationships, families, jobs in the world, responsibilities in society and the world. In fact, it's exactly the reverse of 100 years ago. If you're in a room of 100 or 1,000 spiritual seekers now, and you ask how many of you are members of a consecrated spiritual order, very few hands will go up. If you ask how many of you are consecrated to a life of celibacy, very few hands go up, almost none. And then if you want to joke with them, you ask how many of you are keeping your vows. A few more hands slip down and people hide behind their chairs. Times have changed. This is really a time where the divine is bringing the process of awakening and God realization out of the monasteries and out of the ashrams and into the mainstream of human life. It's time now not just for a few people, a spiritual elite, to be awakening, but for all of humanity to awaken, for the collective consciousness of humanity to shift. And most seekers, and I would say most people in higher states of consciousness, are living what we could call ordinary human lives with relationships, families, and jobs. So because of that, there's also been the need for a different kind of model in our teachers. If you, again, turn the clock back 100 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, I mean, there's Buddha, and Buddha is celibate and living a life of meditation with his disciples. You have the Lord Jesus Christ, who was, well, there are a few that say he had a thing going with Mary Magdalene, but the overall tradition and what Jesus says about the spiritual life points to Jesus as being a celibate man. St. Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, was celibate. Having said that, most of the apostles, if not all the apostles of Jesus, other than Paul, were married, including Peter. And they traveled with their wives. And that was something that was understood as being healthy and good. And Jesus said, it's not up to you. It's according to your calling. Not everyone is called to a life of single celibacy. And obviously, Peter, who was asking him about that, was one who was married already. Jesus was visiting his house. Peter's wife was cooking for them. It was, but typically, the enlightened master was one who was a single celibate. In India, many of the spiritual teachers are members of the Swami order. They're typically celibate and wear orange robes, which is a symbol of their renunciation. A lot of people don't know that you can actually be a member of the Swami order and still have relations with your partner until I think you're 55. I forget now. I'm no expert, but we have some friends who actually are members of the Swami order, and now they've passed that time in their lives. But they were able to not be celibate for up to a certain age, and still. But generally, I mean, certainly, members of the Swami order are generally celibate, and et cetera, et cetera. Historically. But now, because of what I was saying, that a different example is needed. Those of us who are living ordinary lives in the world go, how can I be expected to live a life of meditation like the Buddha, or like the Tibetan Lamas, or like the Swamis, or like, the Christian mystic monks that reached very high states of enlightenment, like St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila. There are hundreds and hundreds of these Western saints that ascended into very, very high states of consciousness. Exactly the same. They parallel what Eastern masters experience in samadhi and in enlightened states. They are just given different names. And traditionally, those people pursued those states in monastic communities. So what are we supposed to do? We can't live like those people whose books we're reading. So more and more teachers have come into the mainstream at this time who are living married lives and are enlightened teachers. I think one of the more prominent ones that made a huge splash, maybe before your time, but in the late 20th century, was Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And they were two highly awakened and God-realized teachers who were married and lived a married life. I could name others in India today who are like Aman Bhagwan, that a lot of people know about. And they were very clear about it, that they felt that they were called to be an example of spiritual teachers who raised a family and lived together. There are many more like that. In the West, we have Eckhart Tolle and his wife, and she's in a very beautiful state too, and they teach a lot together. There's a reason for that. We need to see the example of people who can bring the spiritual path through into ordinary human life. And we're going to be seeing more and more of it because the whole human race is in the process of shifting. And eventually, everybody who still lives on this planet is going to be in a very highly altered state of consciousness compared to the state that most people are in now. We're very much looking forward to it. But that is really a great question. I like to give this example because I think it illustrates an important point. All of the monastic orders, whether we're talking about Buddhist or Christian, they take vows, make a commitment to celibacy, to poverty, to non-possession of wealth, and to obedience to their master or their superior in their religious order. And so they take these vows that in the West are poverty, chastity, and obedience. But it's no different if you're a Taoist monk or a Buddhist monk or a Hindu monk. You're going to be living that way. And why is that? It transcends religious dogma. And I'm going to give a very light brush to this, but the first chakra deals with possessions, security, stability, rootedness in the earth, substance. So chakra number 1 is wealth. It causes people a lot of trouble. I mean, the Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. Not money, the love of it, or we should say the lust for it. And so a monk takes a vow renouncing ownership. And so there's no more trouble with the first chakra and any seduction to possessions or wealth. And then the second chakra is about sensory connection, but about pleasure. And it's generally linked to, because it is the chakra that's primarily the focal point, with sexuality. Obviously, that causes people in the world a lot of issues, okay? So the monk, in addition to renouncing wealth, renounces sex and will only accept ecstasy. I mean, monks know sexual ecstasy, and nuns too, but it comes from source, it comes from spirit, it comes from within the heart. And they renounce that outer human love in order to focus exclusively on that spiritual ecstasy and love. So that's the vow of poverty and chastity. And then obedience, third chakra. Third chakra is the chakra of power and control. And obviously that's a lot of trouble. I mean, all the stuff that people wrestle with, almost all of it is in the first three chakras. It's the seduction for material wealth. It's the seduction for ecstasy and sensual pleasure. It's the seduction for power and control, which we have next to none of, you know. So, but people want as much as they can get, and so the monk renounces power by taking a vow of obedience to their master or their spiritual superior. Now here's the idea. If it works, you have just renounced all the problems in the first three chakras, leaving the monk free to fly from the fourth chakra up, heart chakra, throat chakra, third eye chakra, crown chakra. Good stuff, all good stuff. And so for some people who are called to that life, that way of life, taking those three vows, making that commitment, leaves them free from attachment to earthly things, sensual things, and the things of personal power. And they're able to fly in unconditional love and just soar into the spirit. That's the idea. And all the religious orders do it. I mean, I'm a Franciscan, because once a Franciscan, always a Franciscan. Franciscans wear these gorgeous brown robes that are really ratty and simple, but with a rope belt with 3 knots tied in it. And those 3 knots represent poverty, chastity, and obedience. The same thing I'm talking about. Okay, so what happens when it doesn't work? Well, I could give you examples, but sometimes a person, in trying to renounce the first 3 chakras and fly above them in the monastic life, is actually trying to avoid facing karmic issues and charges that they brought into this life with them that need to be faced. And the divine doesn't let us out of facing all of our charges and all of our buried unconscious material. So one of the great enlightened Christian monks of the 20th century was Thomas Merton. He started the Zen Buddhist Catholic dialogue, and D.T. Suzuki was like one of his best spiritual friends, and they'd talk about enlightenment and all that. Well, Thomas Merton lived half his life as a kind of it was kind of debauched. The second half of his life, he became a Trappist monk, which is very austere. They maintained silence, and he was a hermit, so he lived alone and in silence. But it seems that evidently, maybe, don't get mad at me if you know him, that he was trying to escape or eclipse those first 26 years or so of his life where he was living the life of a playboy, by committing himself to this austere rigidity. And it got to a certain point where one night he was found outside his hermitage, drunk with a naked lady in the lake swimming. It didn't destroy his calling, but it really shook things up. What happened? It's the same thing that happened to a lot of masters that came to the West in the 1960s and 70s. I really don't want to mention names, but I could. A lot of people are aware that a lot of Christian televangelists fell into, all kinds of outrageous sexual abuse. But what not everyone may be aware is that many of the great swamis and yogis and Zen masters and Tibetan masters began to fall into the lust for wealth. I mean, there's one famous teacher, he had over 50 Rolls Royces, did all kinds of extravagance. Why did the austere enlightened master need all those Rolls Royces, which each one costs a fortune? And these others fell prey to sexual lust and began to have multiple partners and have sex with their disciples, which really is not only unethical, it can cause extreme harm to the disciple to have the master do that. And the other thing was power. A lot of the masters became like cult leaders and began to exert an excessive amount of control and direction over their followers' lives. That was chakra 1, 2, and 3, falling into wealth, falling into sex, falling into power. And how could that happen to someone that had spent their life in an ashram or a monastery and attained a very high state of oneness, of unity consciousness, because there was all this material in the first 3 chakras that had never actually been processed? And so in the divine economy, they reached a point where, down they went and had to face that stuff. It was quite embarrassing for them and for their spiritual communities, but a lot of it is because they didn't deal with these areas of their lives. And we're in a time where that's absolutely essential. These masters came out of their ashrams, many in the Far East, and they were living in America in the 1960s where there were absolutely no boundaries whatsoever. You could just do whatever you wanted. In India, a master is protected by the disciples and the other members of the spiritual community. A woman cannot touch a male master. A man cannot touch a female master. They're protected from whatever sparks might fly. But come to the United States and suddenly you're a celebrity, you're on stage and the groupies are trying to get close to you because they feel the mojo, the power. And so a lot of it was because of the way that Western society is so loose, but also partially because the communities surrounding these masters and teachers didn't realize what they were going to be open to and vulnerable to here and weren't able to protect them. But why did they need protecting at all? Because evidently the traditional monastic model did not in every case, if in any case, help you to grow through those first 3 layers. And anyway, we could go on and on with this, because I made a study years ago, and it's an area of real interest to me, of why so many charismatic leaders, whether they were Buddhist or Hindu or Christian or otherwise, great spiritual leaders, very charismatic leaders with tremendous spiritual gifts flowing through them that were transforming people's lives, would fall. At some point in their career, they would fall, and it would always be an abuse of power, an abuse of sex, or an abuse of money, or some combination of the 3. And so I did an in-depth, really academic study of all of these masters from around the turn of the 20th century, a little bit before that, all through the 20th century. And it was shocking, honestly, to see how many of the very charismatic public spiritual teachers at some point fell into this thing I'm talking about. So that's a really great question, you know.
Like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm winding down.
Okay.
Hand off.
Okay. I was meditating on that while Michael was speaking, and I don't know if I would use the word necessary, but I think that a big part of people's spiritual process is to go on to a retreat in an ashram or a monastery, and the people that are living there are so consecrated to that kind of life and that stillness and that quiet that it creates an energy field where if you go to a retreat at being hosted at a monastery or an ashram, you're able to just get away from the world and your normal life and just go really deep into your own spiritual process. And so for some people that's been profoundly helpful. We all have our journey on how we get to the point where everything around us is like being in a monastery or an ashram, where we're connected and we're in the present moment and in the now and in our hearts. But it's not always easy to get there. I think we all know that. There's so much stuff we need to unearth about ourselves. And like Michael just said, the first 3 chakras, and just working through basic human stuff. It can be a lot easier if we do have the support of a quiet place like that. Now that could be in nature, that could be pretty much anywhere, but there are certain places that are more prone to that kind of peace and quiet, because the people that are there are hosting that. They're supporting it. They're consenting to it.
One of the great places that a lot of people don't realize are the Catholic retreat centers.
Yeah.
And a lot of people go to them that aren't Catholic at all, because they cultivate a contemplative space.
Right.
Like Suzanne was talking about. And it surprised me, I didn't know that till I was quite mature in life, about the Catholic retreat centers and how amazing they can be. And I know so many Catholic lay people with a contemplative side who have gone on silent retreats. Most Catholic retreat centers have silent retreats for several days or a week, or sometimes more, where you are given to pure silence, what we call Mauna in India. And I have friends that have had mind-blowing breakthroughs. And all they did was spend 5 days in silence and pray a little and talk to the divine. And they're often not very structured. And I think the less structured in some ways, it depends on the person. But so for some of us, it's really necessary. I was kind of chuckling when you were talking, because I was remembering how a lot's happened in the last 15 years. But 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I was in a space where this place, America just drove me nuts. And about 3 or 4 times a year, I would reach a point where I couldn't stand it, and I needed to go back to India and spend some time in an ashram. And I did that 3 or 4 times a year for a number of years. So yeah, it was necessary for me. I was blowing up. But that's great. It's not an all or nothing thing where we're either called to the monastery, we can't benefit. And because there are many of us that need those retreat spaces where they've created the silence and the contemplative space, because some of us need that to go to, others are called to provide it.
Yeah, when I went to India, as a mother with small children, I was like, wow, I don't have to cook, I don't have to do laundry, I don't have to, do anything of the daily go get groceries, I don't have to drive, I don't have to do anything but just be in the space and allow, as much growth to happen as was possible. And so there's the other benefit to going to an ashram.
William follows up with another question. Great info. Curious where those went wrong. Well, by not facing their issues and working through them, and by not being honest when they saw that they were getting sucked into power and control issues, sexuality, and the lust for wealth. It should have been obvious to them. But
I think what happens too is, okay.
So So the question William's asking wasn't really so much where did they go wrong, because we talked a lot about that, but how does one best process the lower 3 chakra issues?
I was going to say, how they went wrong was ego. I mean, our ego is still here even after awakening or being a great master or whatever, and all of a sudden you're out of this little tiny village where you've got some followers and you're this big celebrity superstar, and it pops up, and then you get drawn into those first 3 chakras.
Now, some would go, well, no, an enlightened master has no ego. Well, we're not going to argue that. We've seen a lot of masters with egos. But that said, there's another explanation which Ken Wilber came up with. Ken Wilber's group, the think tank that eventually has become the Integral Institute, he's a brilliant esoteric philosopher, Buddhist philosopher, but very interfaith. They were trying to find for like 20 years why these masters fell. Because they were well aware of it. They were very involved in the Zen Buddhist, Tibetan, American Buddhist community, and they saw this trouble with the teachers. And so what went wrong? Okay. And what they found, what they created was a lattice or a graph. And one level shows the level of consciousness that the teacher's on. So you could be on a gross level, on a subtle level, on a causal level, or on a unitive level. Roughly, the Western traditions break it down into like 4 states, where you end up in a unity state of consciousness, which is oneness. Okay, that's an awakened state. But undeniably, there were these masters in awakened states that were doing really funky things they shouldn't have been doing. And so they discovered there are other lines of development. It isn't all a matter of whether you're in dual, or gross, subtle, causal, or unitive consciousness. There's also a line of development in moral consciousness, in ethics, in integrity, is like telling the truth. There are places and cultures where telling the truth isn't a big deal. There's no "thou shalt not lie," and lying's quite normal. And there are certainly places in the world where masters, in certain parts of, I'm not going to single out any cultures, but look down on women, that women are inferior. And that's obviously not a very highly developed state of consciousness when it comes to gender wisdom. So you end up with a master with the morals of an alley cat who would lie, steal, and cheat. But they're still in this very high state of consciousness, so they can kind of get away with it up to a point. But what they discovered there was, because of the lack of development in the area of ethics and integrity and sexuality and morality, that it left chinks in the armor, if you will, of the masters. It left holes where they could be dragged down and be less than effective in their calling. And so to be really awakened and transformed requires integrity or integral development of humanity on various levels: aesthetics, morals, ethics. There are lots of levels in which human consciousness needs to evolve and grow, in addition to just whether you're in duality or unity.
And also, I've seen throughout the years so many people craving higher states of consciousness, craving enlightenment, craving awakening, and all of this. And as I've developed on my own spiritual path, I find it infinitely more important to work on the things that Michael was saying, the things that really come from the heart. And is this moral? Is this ethical? Is this clear? Is this coming from a place of love and peace? As opposed to wanting and craving more light, more enlightenment, more awakening.
But I do exactly. I yearn for more light. Always more light, more light, more light. Why not have it all.
Right.
It's not either
But
or.
it's got
That's
to
the
be
thing.
coming from the heart, because oftentimes the ones that's craving these higher states and these awakenings, it's coming from the ego and the mind.
True.
And it's so tricky, it's so subtle, you don't actually realize that it's being done from that place.
Good point. There are also people that are highly developed ethically and aesthetically and morally, who unfortunately are in a completely dualistic mental state of mind. So they're very evolved intellectually in some ways, and morally and socially very developed. What they're missing is a unitive state of consciousness. So integral spirituality, which is something we talked about a lot more several years ago. And if you want to know more about it, honestly, a great book is Integral Spirituality by Ken Wilber. It is not an easy read, but it holds the answers to so many questions and presents a model of human consciousness and evolution. All states in all stages and all lines of development have been put together by this incredible think tank of very awakened and very brilliant people. And so fortunately it's not either or. You know, we can have both. We can be awakened and be really evolved as human beings. and vice versa. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep, thank you. That was a great question. That pretty much did it for tonight.
Yeah, it did. Good one.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so it is time for those intention blessings I was talking about. Nayana blessings of intent. And so to prepare ourselves for this, I'd just like to invite us to close our eyes and dive into the sacred space of our spiritual hearts. Where the divine dwells within you as source and center of your being, as your highest sacred self, none other than the divine presence within you. And not just a little drop, not just a little spark. Rumi, the great Sufi mystic, said, "You are not a drop of the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. The entire divine source, entire universe is resident within you. The outer world is but a reflection of the inner world." So invoke the divine presence within you. There's never been any distance between you and the divine itself. The distance we may have felt and experienced was our own making. The mind creates, for many of us, an illusion of separateness, not just from each other and the world and nature, but from the divine itself. And there is no distance, for in the presence we live and move and have our being. We exist within the presence, just as the presence exists in its fullness within us. And it is pure, unconditional love. It loves you beyond our ability to comprehend. This divine being loves us so much and yearns to help us, to give us grace, to grow, to awaken, to transform. So welcome it. Invoke the presence. Simply take a strong intent to be awakened, to flower and be transformed in oneness with all that is. And then just let go. And receive the flowering heart blessing, which is pouring out to you from within you, from all around you, from above you. Just receive and drink it in. The Divine Presence knows you better than you know you and loves you anyway. And the Divine knows exactly what you need. But you could go ahead and just ask the Divine for help in whatever area you're struggling, for yourself or for another. You don't need to beg, you don't need to plead, just ask for grace to help. And then just let go. Surrender it into the hands of the Divine and receive the blessing. The Divine wants to release you from torment and conflict and flood you with peace. The Divine wants to flood you with light, insight, inspiration, intuition. The Presence wants to flood you with healing, spirit, soul, body, and relationships. The Divine wants to flood your life with abundance and prosperity. Receive. Whatever unprocessed charges, programs arise within you, the way to overcome them is not to resist them at all. Feel them. Feel the charges. Feel the seduction. Don't feed it. Just don't judge it. Love whatever arises and watch it discharge and release from your being. The release from all these difficulties we encounter within ourselves is not some masterminded scheme. It's all quite spontaneous. It's a work of grace. Receive the blessings of the Divine and just let go. Now I invite you to visualize, to imagine us sitting together in a big circle. And with your eyes still closed, lift up your hands with your palms open, facing forward, and invite the presence to pour the flowering heart blessing through you to all the others seated with you in the satsang, in the blessing circle. Know that they too are inviting the presence to pour the blessing through them back to you. And now you can relax your hands and just lay them somewhere in your lap with your palms open, turned upward. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and begin to make direct eye contact with Suzanne and or me. Just make sure you're continuously looking at least one of our eyes as we enter the light meditation. The divine floods Suzanne and me and pours through us oceans of grace, light, and unconditional love. Through every pore of our being, but especially through the eyes, which are the doorways of the soul. So as you keep making eye contact without doing anything else but looking, that light streams in through your eyes, into your heart of hearts, your spiritual heart, causing the flames of divine love, light, and transformation to burn brighter and brighter and brighter within you. The light will melt blocks and open your heart and ignite your process of transformation. Nothing for you to do, but just keep looking. meditate for a few more minutes as the grace settles within you. Now continue meadowing. Keep meadowing all you want, and meditate as long as it feels good to you. You could also lie down nearby in Shavasana. That is to lie on your back with your eyes closed, your arms loosely at your sides with your palms open, turned upward, and just let yourself dissolve in gratitude in the presence. It's a lovely thing. You should try it if you haven't. We love you guys so much.
Much love, light, and blessings until we connect again.
Until the next time, the divine in us acknowledges and sees the divine in you, and we bow to you. Namaste.
Namaste.